The spoon clinked softly against the side of Thomas's mug, each delicate sound echoing through the kitchen like a countdown I didn't know I was waiting for. Morning sunlight streamed through the window panes in slanted gold beams, catching the edge of the countertop, the handle of the kettle, the rim of the blue ceramic mug he used every day. And yet, something felt off. Too still, too quiet, as though the entire house was holding its breath. I sat across from him in the same chair I'd used for over 3 decades, hands resting gently in my lap, palms cold despite the warm tea, beside me. His eyes didn't meet mine. Instead, they stayed fixed on the steam curling upward from his cup, like there was something in it that held all the answers to questions he hadn't dared to ask until now. Then he said it. If I could go back, Claire, I wouldn't have married you. No anger, no hesitation, just that. As if he were stating the weather forecast. As if 35 years of marriage, of raising children, of shared meals and shared griefs and shared silences, could be measured out and dismissed in a single breath. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I wasn't sure I remembered how. His voice had carried the same tone he used when discussing the cost of lumber or the status of a new project for his contracting business. Calm, factual, devoid of emotion. But what he said wasn't numbers or scheduling. It was my life. My entire life unraveling in the quiet comfort of our kitchen. The first thing I noticed wasn't even my own reaction. It was the way the clock ticked louder than usual. The way the refrigerator hummed, persistent and oblivious, as though the world outside hadn't just shifted on its axis. And still, I didn't cry. After 35 years, you'd think a woman would react, scream, slam a door, demand an explanation. But I didn't do any of that. Not because I didn't want to, but because there was nothing left in me to push back with. His words had confirmed something I had long suspected, but never dared admit, even to myself. I stood up slowly. My body felt older than it had the day before. Not in pain, in weight. The weight of years, of unspoken disappointment, of silences that had grown so long, they replaced conversation. I climbed the stairs without looking back. In our bedroom, everything was exactly as it had been the day before. His cufflinks still rested neatly in the glass tray. My robe still hung on the hook by the door. The bed was made. It almost made me laugh, how perfect it all looked, like a showroom version of our life. Staged. Sterile. I opened the top drawer of the nightstand, and there it was, my journal. A soft, leather-bound notebook I'd bought on a whim 5 years ago at a boutique in Charleston. I had told myself I would use it to jot down poetry or dreams, or maybe even start that novel I used to talk about when we first got married. But instead, it became a place where I kept the parts of myself no one else saw, especially him. I flipped through the pages. Each entry was a breadcrumb back to who I had been, a woman full of color, laughter, ideas. Somewhere along the way, I had turned the volume down on all of it to make room for him, for the children, for keeping everything moving. But this morning, Thomas's sentence cracked something open. Not because I didn't know it was coming, but because now it had finally been said. He wasn't angry when he said it. And strangely, neither was I. If he had yelled, if he had accused, maybe I would have fought back. Maybe we would have had something to burn down together. But instead, he dropped the match and walked away, leaving me in a house soaked with memories, and no flame to ignite it. Downstairs, he hadn't moved. I could hear the scrape of the spoon again. Tap, tap, tap. As though it were a metronome keeping time to the last beats of our marriage. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't need to. Leaving isn't always about grabbing what you own. Sometimes it's about releasing what you've been carrying, what you've been clutching to your chest because letting go felt like admitting failure. I went back to the nightstand, ran my fingers across the journal's spine, and opened to a blank page. The first entry in over a year. My hand trembled, only slightly as I wrote the date. Then just one line. I am not broken. I am becoming. I closed the journal, placed it gently back in the drawer, and stood. I didn't look around the room again. Didn't check for the little things, the comb on the dresser, the earrings in the dish. They could stay. They belonged to the woman who used to wait. I wasn't waiting anymore. My name is Claire Whitman, and this is the story of how my husband told me I was his biggest mistake, and how that single moment became the best gift I never asked for. Because what happened after that? It didn't just change him, it changed everything. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, or if you've ever had to rebuild your sense of self from the ashes of silence, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support means the world and keeps these stories alive for others who might need to hear them too. Before you go, here's a quick question to get your thoughts and keep this conversation going. Question: what would you have done if your partner said your marriage was a mistake? After 35 years, A, stay and try to fix it, hoping for closure. B, leave and rediscover who you are. Let us know in the comments. Type A or B and tell us why. Your voice matters. The house didn't change after that morning. The chairs still creaked the same way. The old wooden floor still groaned in the hallway near the stairs. The garden still bloomed, untouched, unaware, persistent. But I had changed. Something within me had shifted, not like an explosion, but like the slow tectonic movement of something buried deep underground finally giving way. Thomas went back to his routines almost immediately, as if nothing had been said, as if the sentence that had landed like a hammer against my heart was just part of the usual morning shuffle. Maybe for him it was. But for me, it was the beginning of a quiet undoing. I didn't leave that day, not in body. Instead, I drifted. Not outward, but inward, toward memories I hadn't visited in years, pieces of myself I'd boxed up and shelved. I remembered the first time I met Thomas. It was 1986, Raleigh, North Carolina. I had just started my first full-time job as a high school art teacher, young and stubborn, full of ideas I thought could change the world. He was helping his uncle with a local contracting project near the school, a gym renovation, I think, and we collided outside the faculty parking lot. Literally, I backed into his truck. I was mortified. He laughed. That was the first moment I noticed how calm he was, how steady. I remember thinking, this man is safe. We started dating that fall. He wasn't a man of many words, but he listened, or at least I thought he did. I'd ramble on about my students, my lesson plans, my dreams of starting a weekend art co-op, and he'd nod, eyes soft with what I assumed was admiration. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer solutions, just let me talk. And back then, that was enough. We married 2 years later, a modest ceremony in my parents' backyard. I wore my grandmother's lace veil, and he wore a blue suit that didn't quite fit but made him look like someone I could lean on for the rest of my life. We honeymooned in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It rained most of the week, but we didn't mind. We stayed in a small cabin, cooked together, read paperbacks by the fireplace. I remember thinking, this is the start of something beautiful. It was. For a while. When Mason was born, I had already been teaching for 6 years. I remember holding him for the first time and realizing how instantly my definition of purpose had shifted. I told Thomas I wanted to take a year off. He said, whatever you think is best. And that was the start of me putting myself aside. Quietly. one thoughtful, reasonable decision at a time. After Mason came Eliza. She was spirited from the moment she entered the world, fierce, intelligent, observant. I used to sit on the floor with her in the mornings, finger painting while Mason built castles out of blocks nearby. Those were the days I thought would define me. Sticky fingers, peanut butter sandwiches, bedtime stories read under the soft glow of nightlights. But what no one told me was that motherhood can swallow a woman whole if she's not careful. My art supplies were pushed to the back of the closet to make room for diapers. My lesson plans were replaced by grocery lists. The community art studio I'd dreamed of opening became a someday plan that eventually withered beneath piles of laundry and lost socks. And Thomas? He worked, hard, consistently, reliably. He built his own contracting business from the ground up and was respected in town. He was never cruel, never raised his voice. He didn't cheat or lie or hit, but he also didn't ask, didn't wonder. Didn't see that the woman he came home to each night was quietly disappearing behind casseroles and polite smiles. We drifted, gently and unknowingly at first. Our conversations became transactional. Can you pick up Mason from practice? The water heater needs replacing. Eliza has that dentist appointment on Tuesday. The intimacy drained from our days, like water leaking slowly from a cracked pipe, too subtle to notice until everything felt empty. I kept the house pristine, not because Thomas asked me to, but because I needed something to feel like an accomplishment. I knew how he liked his shirts folded. I knew which light bulbs needed changing. I knew how to refill the spice rack with precision. And somewhere, in those tasks, I lost the version of myself who used to dance barefoot in the kitchen to Billie Holiday. Sometimes, I caught glimpses of that woman in the mirror, usually when no one else was home. A certain look in my eyes, a tired defiance, a flicker of rebellion. I would think, she's still in there. But then the door would open, and I'd smooth my hair, pick up a dish towel, and let her vanish again. When the kids grew older, I thought things would shift. I imagined Thomas and I taking short weekend trips like we used to. Maybe we'd go back to that rainy cabin in the Blue Ridge. Maybe we'd rediscover something. But he never mentioned it, never hinted at it, and eventually, I stopped hoping. The house grew quieter as Mason left for college and Eliza began spending more nights with friends. I had time again, but I didn't know what to do with it. So I volunteered at the library. I organized bake sales. I filled my calendar with errands to avoid the silence that filled the rooms where laughter used to live. Looking back, I wonder how long Thomas had been carrying that sentence before he finally said it. If I could go back, I wouldn't have married you. How many dinners had he sat through thinking those words? How many Sunday mornings had he looked at me across the table and swallowed them? And how many times had I felt it without needing to hear it? We weren't angry with each other. That was the tragedy. We had simply stopped being anything other than logistical partners. I was the woman who remembered to buy the right toothpaste. He was the man who fixed the leaky faucet. We ran our home like a well-oiled machine. Efficient, predictable, completely loveless. And still, I stayed. Because that's what women like me were taught to do. Make it work. Keep it together. Prioritize the family. But when I looked back at those early dreams, of teaching art, of opening a small studio near the coast, of traveling with nothing but a camera and a sketch pad, I realized I had silenced myself for so long that even I couldn't hear my own voice anymore. What haunted me wasn't just the sentence Thomas spoke that morning. It was the fact that I had known it for years and done nothing. That I had accepted a life that required me to become less in order for everything else to run smoothly. That realization was what kept me awake at night in the days that followed. Not rage, not heartbreak, but regret. And then something else, something softer but stronger, a kind of quiet hunger, not for love, not even for validation, but for me. I found a photograph tucked into an old book on our shelf one afternoon. A picture of me at 23, paintbrush in hand, wild curls escaping a loose braid, a streak of red paint across my cheek. I looked so alive, so unaware of what she would give up in the name of stability. I held that photo and whispered to her, "I'm sorry I left you behind." But I also made her a promise. I'm coming back. That night, I opened my journal. Again, this time, I wrote more than one line. I used to think that marriage meant sacrificing parts of yourself for something greater. But now I see that sacrifice without recognition isn't love. It's slow erasure. I want to see myself again. I want to remember how it feels to live like that girl in the photo. And that was the first moment I knew. I wasn't staying. Not just in the house. In the role. In the silence, I didn't know exactly what the next steps would be. I wasn't planning an escape. I wasn't ready for announcements or confrontations. But the seed had been planted. And it was growing. There's something terrifying about waking up and realizing you've spent most of your adult life being someone you no longer recognize. But there's also something liberating in knowing it's not too late to change it. Claire Whitman, once an art teacher. Still a mother. Still a wife for now. But also, finally, again, a woman on the verge of remembering who she is. And that was the beginning. There's a moment, after enough silence has passed, where it begins to speak louder than anything else in the room. That's how it felt living in that house after Thomas's confession. He never repeated the words. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge them at all. And I didn't press for more. We simply existed in a space we had both outgrown, but hadn't yet abandoned. He continued to wake up at 6:30 every morning. Coffee, news, work boots. And I continued to fold laundry and sweep the floors like nothing had changed, even though everything had. But I heard the silence now. Heard it like a scream. And once you hear something that loud, you can't pretend it's quiet anymore. One Thursday afternoon, I stood in the hallway and listened to the ticking of the wall clock, sharp even, consistent. It had been Thomas's anniversary gift to me in our 10th year of marriage. I remember thinking back then, how romantic. It was that he chose something so symbolic. Time. But I'd missed the warning in it. We were counting minutes, not making memories. The silence that surrounded that ticking now felt like a metronome counting down to something I couldn't yet name. I began doing small things differently. I stopped making dinner right at 6. Some nights, I wouldn't make anything at all. I stopped asking if he needed anything before he left the house. I stopped leaving notes on the kitchen counter with reminders. And the strange part was, he didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't say anything. That's when it hit me. I could disappear completely, and it might take days for anyone to ask where I'd gone. One evening, Eliza came over for dinner. She swept into the house like a gust of city wind. Sharp, fast-moving, perfumed with too much cologne and too little time. She hugged me with one arm, her phone still in the other hand. "You look tired, Mom," she said, not really looking at me. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, and it felt like a betrayal to myself, even as I said it. Thomas was already seated at the table, scrolling through something on his phone. Eliza sat across from him, launching into a story about a new deal she was brokering at her firm. High numbers, high stakes, high speed. I nodded where appropriate, offered smiles where expected. When she mentioned the possibility of a promotion in New York, her father looked up and said, "That's my girl, always aiming high." I glanced at him, just for a second. But he didn't. "Meet my eyes. That's wonderful," I said, quieter than I meant to. Eliza glanced at me, then turned to Thomas. "I mean, Mom probably doesn't get half of what I'm talking about, but she's always a good cheerleader, right?" She laughed. Thomas smirked. I didn't. I stared at my plate, and felt the words I didn't say curl inside me like a knot. This was the daughter I had spent years raising, encouraging, defending, teaching to speak her mind. And now here she was, learning how to silence others in the very tone she used on me. After dinner, I cleaned up alone. Neither of them noticed I hadn't eaten more than 3 bites. In the quiet of the kitchen, with my hands in the sink, I caught my reflection in the window pane. There she was again, the woman I barely recognized. Her shoulders were curled forward, her smile absent, her eyes tired, but not weak. There was something underneath, something rising. That night, I reopened the small box I kept in my closet, the one with pieces of a life I had tried to hold on to. An old name tag from my teaching days, a dried sunflower petal from the garden I once dreamed of, a sketch I'd done of Mason when he was 4 years old, asleep on the couch with a book resting on his chest, and tucked under it all was a flyer I had picked up months earlier and forgotten about, a poetry workshop at the public library. I had passed the bulletin board by accident that day, running errands, picking up a book. The flyer had caught my eye, but I hadn't dared to take it seriously. Not then. Not when my world was still on autopilot. But now the idea of sitting in a room where no one knew me as Thomas's wife or Eliza's mother felt like a window cracking open, a way to breathe something different. I registered that night. The workshop started 2 weeks later. Tuesday evenings. A group of 10, mostly women, ranging from their 20s to their 60s. We sat in a circle, clutching notebooks and pens like lifelines. The instructor, a woman named Sylvia with graying curls and eyes that saw everything, invited us to begin with a prompt. Write a truth you've never said out loud. My pen hovered above the paper. My throat tightened. Then, slowly, I wrote, I have loved a man who forgot to look at me. The words startled me in their simplicity. I hadn't even written his name, but the page trembled beneath my hand as I wrote it again. I have loved a man who forgot to look at me. After the session, I stayed behind to help stack chairs. Sylvia walked over and placed a hand on my arm. That line, she said gently. It felt like a scream on a whisper. I didn't know how to respond, but something in me cracked a little further open. Not broken, just unsealed. Back at home, I didn't tell Thomas where I'd been. He didn't ask. I'm not sure if he noticed I was gone. The weeks passed, and I kept writing. I kept showing up. I even dug my sketch pad out of the garage and began drawing again. Simple things. Mugs, flowers, the edge of our back porch at dusk. It wasn't about being good. It was about being alive. I shared none of this with Eliza. She had grown used to seeing me as a background figure, and I didn't have the energy to battle for space in her curated world. When she did call, it was usually short, efficient. Just checking in, she'd say, and I'd wonder if she really was. Then came the dinner that finally unraveled everything. Thomas suggested we host a small get-together. Just the 4 of us, he said. It's been a while. So I cooked. I cleaned. I set the table with the good dishes, the ones we used to save for company, even when the only company left was obligation. Mason arrived first. He hugged me, tightly, kissed my cheek. He noticed the food, the table, the effort. You did all this? He asked. I thought it might be nice, I said. Eliza came late. She always did. She breezed in with new clothes and sharp heels, kissed the air beside my cheek, and slid into her seat without noticing the fresh tulips I'd cut from the garden. Dinner started with polite chatter, a few shared memories, laughter that felt more like echoes than anything real. Then Eliza brought up a business trip she'd taken to London. Mom, she said, you would have loved the museums. So quaint. Nothing like your art school days, I know, but still. Thomas chuckled. You're talking to the woman who gave up oil paints for dish soap. Eliza laughed. Right. Sorry. Mom, I forgot. You're more the watercolor and window herb garden type now. The air shifted. I smiled. Not with amusement, but with exhaustion. And this time, I didn't let it pass. You know, I said gently, I still have ideas. I still make things. I still dream. They both blinked, surprised. Mason looked at me, really looked. You do? Yes, I said. And I don't need to justify them anymore. I stood up, took my plate to the sink, and left the rest behind. That night, I wrote in my journal, I am tired of waiting to be asked if I matter. I have decided to answer that question for myself. In the weeks that followed, I began planning, something I never imagined I would have the courage to do, leave, not as an act of escape, not to punish anyone, but as a way of honoring the voice inside me that had been screaming through silence for years. It was time. The next part of my life hadn't begun yet, but I was walking toward it now, with clarity, not fear. And for the first time in decades, I felt the presence of someone I had missed more than anyone else. Myself. It was a Tuesday morning when I finally packed a bag, though the decision had been years in the making. Not because of any one event, not even because of the sentence Thomas had spoken weeks earlier that shattered the last illusion I'd clung to. No, it was because I had spent a lifetime ignoring the quiet voice in me that had kept whispering, there's more. The house was still asleep when I stood in front of the hallway mirror with my hand on the doorframe. I looked at my reflection, not to fix my hair or adjust my sweater, but to make eye contact with myself, something I hadn't done in a long time without flinching. I wasn't running away. I wasn't storming out in fury. I had waited long enough for the storm to pass. Now I was choosing the calm on the other side. Simone had called me the day before. She was an old friend from college, someone I had once shared poetry with in Long, letters before life took us in opposite directions. She now lived in Bar Harbor, Maine, a place I remembered only vaguely from a family road trip decades ago, the scent of salt air and pine needles tangled in my memory. I have a spare room, she said over the phone, and enough space for someone who's learning how to breathe again. Her words felt like a lifeline, not dramatic, not demanding. Just open. I left Thomas a note, not out of obligation, but because it was cleaner than disappearing. It wasn't a letter of blame or bitterness. I wrote simply, I need to go where I can hear myself think. I don't know when I'll be back, or if I'll be back at all. Please don't follow me. Let me find my own way. It was taped to the fridge, right next to the list of groceries I'd never buy again. Driving away felt more like an exhale than a departure. I didn't cry when the house disappeared in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. I watched the road unfold in front of me like a ribbon, Maine calling to me not as a place of escape, but of becoming. Simone's cottage sat near the edge of town, modest and weather-worn, nestled between spruce trees and a quiet stretch of shoreline. When I arrived, the sun was just beginning to set, casting golden light across the porch steps and the old driftwood fence. She stepped outside with a mug in her hand and that same easy expression she'd had when we were 20, kind eyes that didn't ask for explanations. You look like someone who just stepped out of a cage, she said gently, pulling me into a hug. I spent the first 2 days doing nothing but resting. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty or accusatory. It was full of possibility, of the kind of space that welcomes rather than isolates. I walked barefoot through her garden. I sat at her kitchen table with tea that didn't grow cold from neglect. I stared out the window at the ocean's slow rhythm and felt my shoulders loosen from the weight they had carried for too long. On the third morning, I opened a blank journal. Not the one I had written in during my marriage. Not the one full of grief and held-back truths. This one was new. I had bought it in town, wrapped in brown paper almost reverently. The first page trembled under my pen. I am not beginning again. I am continuing, with honesty. That afternoon, Simone took me into town. We visited the bookstore, the art supply shop, the local cafe that smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke. People didn't ask me where I was from or what I had left behind. They simply greeted me with warmth, with curiosity that didn't press too hard. It felt like I had stumbled into a town that moved at the pace of healing. The next week, I opened my own bank account. It was the first one in my name alone since I married Thomas. The young man behind the counter asked if I wanted a debit card with my name printed on it. When I saw Claire Whitman appear on the screen, I nearly cried. Not because it was new, but because it had been so long since I'd seen myself as a person who could hold something entirely her own. Simone lent me her old car, and I drove out to a small cliffside park one morning, watching waves crash against the rocks below. There was something wild and holy in that sound. I brought my sketch pad with me and drew the outline of the horizon. Not perfect, not even good, but mine. I started volunteering once a week at a community center in town. They hosted art sessions for senior women, many of whom, like me, had let their creative lives go dormant. I didn't come in as a teacher. I came in as a participant. We sat in a sunlit room with paint-stained aprons and trembling hands, laughing over crooked lines and colors that didn't blend quite right. It felt like communion. One of the women, a widow named Joan, leaned over one day and said, "You have kind eyes, Claire, but they look like they're learning how to smile." Again, I nodded, and for once I didn't deflect. A few weeks later, Thomas reached out. He didn't call. He mailed a letter. Thick envelope, no return address. Inside was a note, written in the same blocky handwriting I had once loved. The first line read, "I found your journal." My chest tightened. I didn't know you felt so alone. And I don't blame you for leaving. I reread your words more than once. Every time I did, I saw myself less as a man, and more as a mirror reflecting back all that I never asked about. I thought I was giving you stability. I realize now I gave you solitude. He ended the letter with, "I won't ask you to come back. But if peace lives where you are now, then I hope you build your life around it. You deserve that." He had signed over the house to me, transferred our savings into a joint access account, but said he would never touch it again. It was, he wrote, "a small offering toward the freedom I never thought you needed." I folded the letter and set it aside. I didn't cry. I didn't rush to respond. I felt released. Not because he had changed, not because he finally understood, but because in that moment, I knew I no longer needed his understanding to validate my choice. The following week, I took Simone's advice and visited an old weather-beaten building on the edge of town that had once been a pottery studio. It was vacant. A "for lease" sign hung in the window. I stood in front of it for a long time, imagining shelves of brushes, jars of glaze, wooden tables scratched with stories. I walked inside with the realtor the next day. It smelled of salt and dust and possibility. Signed the lease a week later. The name came to me in the middle of a sleepless night. Second light. Because some people don't burn out. They just need to be reignited. I spent my mornings painting the walls, hanging old canvases, building shelves. Simone helped me find a few local artists who were eager to offer classes to women starting over. We put up flyers. We opened our doors with no big ceremony. Just a handwritten sign and a warm lamp glowing through the front window. The first person to walk in was a woman named Irene, 63, retired nurse. She had lost her husband 2 years ago and didn't know what to do with her evenings. She picked up a brush with shaking hands and told me, "I don't need to be good. I just need to feel again." That's when I realized Second Light wasn't just mine. It was for all of us, And in giving others permission to reclaim themselves, I found my own voice again. In the evenings, I wrote in my journal. I wrote about color, about failure, about lavender fields I wanted to see in person. I wrote about solitude, not as a wound, but as a sanctuary. I wrote poems that didn't rhyme, and dreams that didn't scare me anymore. Claire Whitman, not just a name on a card, not just a signature on a lease, but a woman returning to the shape of her own soul. And still, this was not the end. It was the breath between chapters. The sacred pause before the words returned, bolder and truer than ever. Mornings at second light began slowly. The windows filled with soft sun as I swept the wooden floors and opened the door to the scent of the sea. The tables held stories now. Brush, strokes from trembling hands, half-finished watercolors of forgotten dreams, clay figures shaped in hesitant but hopeful curves. Every object in that small studio bore fingerprints of women relearning how to touch the world with care. And somewhere between their rediscovery, I found the parts of myself I'd long buried beneath someone else's life. It had been 6 months since I left Asheville. 6 months since I packed my bag before dawn and walked away from the version of myself that had learned how to disappear in silence. Here in Bar Harbor, I wasn't just healing. I was building. I taught 2 workshops each week, nothing formal, just guided quiet time for women like me who had traded parts of themselves for family, for marriage, for survival. We didn't talk much during class, but after, we'd sit on the porch steps with chipped mugs of coffee and stories that had waited years to be told. One afternoon, a letter arrived in a soft blue envelope with no return address. I recognized the careful handwriting immediately. It was from Eliza. She hadn't written before. She hadn't even called since I left. And in some private way, I understood. My daughter had grown up watching me model a life of quiet endurance. I'd taught her to seek power, success, independence. But I had also shown her, unintentionally, how to look past the person holding it all together. Inside the envelope was a single-page letter. The first line read, "I thought strength looked like you never breaking." The next was harder to read. "Now I realize you were breaking all the time. You just did it quietly so the rest of us didn't have to watch." She told me she had found the journal I left behind, hidden in my study, tucked behind boxes of lesson plans and pressed flowers. She wrote about reading it in one sitting, unable to stop, pages softening beneath her fingertips as she finally saw the woman behind the mother she'd taken for granted. "I'm sorry, Mom," she wrote. "I don't know how to make it right, but I'd like to learn who you are. Not as my mother, as you." That evening, I sat with the letter folded between my hands like a fragile bird. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt the quiet warmth of something I had stopped waiting for, recognition not of what I had given, but of who I had always been underneath the giving. Eliza visited 2 weeks later. She arrived without fanfare, no flashy outfit, no high-speed monologue about meetings or deals. Just a small overnight bag and a face softer than I remembered. We spent the afternoon walking the coastal trail near the cottage. She asked about the studio, about the women who came, about my students and what they painted. And then, as we sat, on a sun-warmed bench overlooking the tide, she asked the question I'd been waiting years to hear. "What did you used to dream of before us?" I told her. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. I told her about the community art space I once wanted to build in my 20s, about traveling across the country with a sketchbook and nothing but time. I told her about the poetry I used to write and the way I once imagined waking up in a home where I wasn't invisible. She listened, really listened. Her eyes didn't wander, her fingers didn't fiddle with a phone. When I finished, she simply reached for my hand and said, "I want to see that version of you. I think I'd really like her." We didn't talk much after that. There was no need. The silence for once felt like presence, not absence. Later that night, she helped me set up the studio for the next day's workshop. As we pinned sketches to the drawing board, she turned to me and asked, "Do you think people can unlearn the way they've been taught to see women?" I thought for a long moment before answering. Only if they're willing to unlearn what they believe love is supposed to look like. Eliza nodded. That was enough. Mason called the following week. His voice was steady, though tinged with something I hadn't heard before. Vulnerability. "Dad called me," he said. "He told me everything. About you leaving. About the journal. I braced myself for disappointment, for guilt. But what he said was this. He told me he's learning how to cook now, that he burned pasta last week but tried again, that he misses your presence, but not because of what you did for him, because he misses seeing you." There was a pause. He said he never really looked. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Mason's voice softened. "I used to think you were just content. You were always so calm, so gentle. I didn't realize that gentleness came at a cost." I closed my eyes, letting his words wrap around me. There had been a time when I longed for this, for my children to see me not as a function, but as a person. Now, hearing it didn't fill me with vindication. It filled me with peace. "I want to do better, Mom," he said. "Not just for you, for the woman I'm dating now. I want her to know I see her." That was his gift to me. Not flowers, not praise. A commitment to break the cycle. And Thomas? He sent one final letter. No pleading, no apology. Just a page filled with quiet truths. "I sit at the kitchen table and look at your chair every morning," he wrote. "It's not the absence that haunts me. It's the silence that used to sit between us. I didn't know it was yours." He had signed over the last of our shared assets and added a note that read, "This isn't an attempt to buy peace. It's just me finally understanding that I stood beside someone extraordinary and never told her so." I never replied. Not because I was bitter, but because closure had already come. Not from his words, but from the life I was building on, my own. One morning in late October, I stood in the doorway of Second Light and watched the leaves drift down like burnt gold confetti. The studio was quiet, the air crisp with change. A woman named Nora, 71, was inside painting her first self-portrait. She had lost her husband a year earlier and hadn't touched a brush in 4 decades. "I thought I was too old to start over," she'd said. I smiled and answered, "Sometimes starting over is just finally choosing yourself." That night, I sat on the porch with a journal in my lap. The last page. I'd been saving it. The sky was layered in stars. The wind moved gently through the trees. And as I pressed my pen to paper, I didn't write a list, or a memory, or a wish. I wrote a declaration. I didn't leave to be alone. I left to be me. And I found her here, where the tide meets the trees, and the air doesn't ask anything of me but to keep breathing. Then I closed the journal, not with sadness, but with reverence. I had thought once that love was sacrifice, that motherhood was erasure, that marriage meant becoming a mirror for someone else's reflection. Now, I knew better. Love is choice, motherhood is legacy, and marriage, if done right, is not ownership. It's witness. And if you are never truly seen, you are never truly held. That was my truth, and this was my life now, unfolding, quietly radiant. Mine. Claire Whitman's story is not one of dramatic explosions or public meltdowns. It is a story told in whispers, in unspoken pain, and in the quiet reclamation of self. It began with a single sentence, spoken by her husband in the soft light of an ordinary morning. If I could go back, I wouldn't have married you. That single line fractured 35 years of marriage, not because it was cruel or shouted, but because it echoed the silence that had already existed for so long between them. What followed wasn't revenge. It wasn't a sudden escape or impulsive rebellion. Instead, it was the gentle, deliberate unfolding of a woman who had spent decades making everyone else's life comfortable while slowly losing sight of her own. Claire had once been vibrant, ambitious, and full of art. Over the years, she traded paintbrushes for spatulas, lesson plans for grocery lists, and dreams for duty. And yet, even in the erasure, something inside her had survived, quietly waiting to be remembered. Her journey wasn't defined by abandonment but by rediscovery. She didn't leave her family to punish them. She left to find herself, and in doing so, she gave them all something they never expected: truth. Thomas, her husband, came to understand the damage of neglect, not just of her as a wife, but of her as a person. Eliza, her daughter, saw for the first time how the version of womanhood she had inherited was built on sacrifice rather than choice. And Mason, her son, learned that emotional blindness can be passed down as easily as family traditions, unless someone decides to break the pattern. Claire didn't rebuild her life with vengeance. She rebuilt it with color, with poems and pottery, and women sitting in circles, painting their way back to themselves. She didn't create a second act in a blaze of glory. She did it slowly, with grace, with presence, with intention. And through that, she showed us something powerful. You don't need to be loud to matter. You don't need to be angry to walk away. And you don't need anyone's permission to start again. The studio she opened, Second Light, became more than a physical space. It was a metaphor, a beacon, a quiet revolution. It welcomed the forgotten, the overlooked, the ones who had spent a lifetime being just a mom, just a wife, just the background. Claire didn't just reclaim her voice. She helped others find theirs too, and that is the beauty of her transformation. It didn't end with her. It rippled outward, touching the lives of those she loved, even those who had once failed to see her clearly. The lesson. We learn, the core of Claire's story is a reminder of a truth many of us ignore for far too long. Self-worth is not measured by how well you serve others. It's measured by how deeply you honor yourself. We live in a world that often praises sacrifice and selflessness, especially in women. But what happens when those sacrifices go unacknowledged? When selflessness becomes invisibility? Claire teaches us that you can give your life to others without giving away your soul. That love without mutual recognition turns into a quiet kind of loneliness, and that it is never too late to choose differently. Whether you're 35 or 65, there is always time to return to the version of yourself that once dreamed, freely. In today's fast-moving world, where we juggle careers, family, expectations, and unspoken roles, it's easy to forget the person we were before we became someone's something. Claire's story urges us to pause, to listen to our own unmet needs, to remember who we are beyond what we do for others. Her journey is not just about leaving a marriage. It's about leaving a life that no longer makes room for your whole self. So how do we apply this to our own lives? Start small. Ask yourself what you've silenced in order to keep the peace. Notice the patterns of dismissal, whether from others or from yourself. Make time to do something that once brought you joy. Write, paint, walk alone in nature, or just sit in stillness and ask, what do I want? And then, honor the answer. Not tomorrow. Not when things calm down. Today. Because as Claire showed us, choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's the most honest thing you'll ever do. Your turn. Let's reflect together. If you were in Claire's shoes, what do you believe is the first step toward reclaiming your own identity? A. Leave the environment that made you feel invisible. B. Start making small changes while still inside the life you've outgrown. Let us know in the comments below. Just type A or B and share why. Your perspective might help someone else see their own story in a new light. And now we'd love to hear from you. What's your biggest takeaway from Claire's journey? Have you ever felt like you lost yourself in silence? Or maybe you're on your way back to who you were meant to be? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can read, relate, and heal together. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create more meaningful content that speaks to the quiet truths many of us carry. And remember, this space is for you, for your voice, for your second light.